I want to talk to you about the open records request, okay? You kind of gave us an explanation of how the process works, so I just want to rehash that out. My understanding is that if an individual makes a request to a state agency, that state agency has a certain time period to go to the Office of Attorney General and make a request for a ruling, right?
There is a statutory time period to request a ruling, yes.
Right, so in this case, the statutory time period, well, for example, when Nate Paul went to the Department of Public Services in March of 2020, if that was March 3rd, they had till March 13th essentially to request your office give an opinion, true?
I do not recall the specific dates, nor do I recall whether it was Nate Paul or one of his attorneys who made that request.
Okay, I just want to clarify, you do not recall the specific dates in which the DPS request by Nate Paul's attorney was made?
It was in the spring of 2020, but I don't recall the precise dates. I'd have to see some documents around that.
Eric, would you mind pulling up Article 3? And while we're doing that, just for a little background, Mr. Bangert, the requests by Nate Paul's attorneys for the records involved in the investigation, it was for initially the Texas State Securities Board, right?
Yes, the initial request went to SSB.
That was in 2019.
Is that a question?
Yeah, that was in 2019.
Yes, it was.
Then you've got DPS. That request was made in the spring of 2020.
That is correct.
And sometime later, arguably end of May, there was a request made for FBI's comment or brief on the DPS request that was originally filed in the spring, right?
I believe that was part of the second request.
Okay, so we're talking about 3 different records requests, correct?
I would classify it as 2 with a secondary request attached to the second.
Okay. And then you also have to throw in the request for reconsideration, right, on the Texas State Securities Board?
That was part of the first file.
So essentially, the Office of Attorney General makes 4 separate decisions about records relating to Nate Paul.
We made at least 3. I don't know if it was 4.
Okay, well, let's go back to fall of 2019. Texas State Securities Board. At that time, was Ken Paxton he was the AG of the Attorney General's office, right?
Yes, he was.
Now, when Nate Paul made that request through Aaron Borden, his attorney, in fall of 2019, that initial request was denied by the Office of Attorney General, was it not?
Yes, the ORD did, well, when you say denied, it sustained the request for exemptions and exceptions by the board.
Sure, meaning that the Texas State Securities Board, while Ken Paxton was AG, was not required to turn over records to Nate Paul.
That's right, the November request did not require turnover of records.
Let's move forward to 2020. You had a conversation with Justin Gordon about a request for reconsideration of the Texas State Security Board records, true?
I did.
And ultimately, you ended up having conversations with Ken Paxton about that request for reconsideration.
I did.
And ultimately, the Office of Attorney General again did not rule that the Texas State Board, the Texas State Securities Board was going to have to turn their records over to Nate Paul, did they?
We did not require them to turn their records over.
Okay. So up until, that puts us in February or March of 2020, would you agree?
We're ballpark in that area, yes.
Right, ballparking it because yesterday you stated it was right around the time COVID started.
Yes.
That's a whole nother convo we'll get into in a little bit. Okay, so Texas State Securities Board records are not given to Nate Paul. Let's move on to DPS. Now, to be clear, the ultimate decision by the Office of Attorney General with regard to the DPS records was that they refused to rule in that situation.
It was a no decision.
Okay, now, I want to talk to you about what that means. If the Office of Attorney General refuses to rule on a records request, that means that the state agency that was requested does not have to turn their records over to the individual, right?
We did not require disclosure based on that ruling.
Okay. And so as a result of that ruling, the Department of Public Safety did not turn their records over to Nate Paul or his attorneys. True?
That ruling did not require disclosure.
Okay. Well, you're aware that there was a writ of mandamus filed by Nate Paul's attorney for those records they were trying to get from you, correct?
You're going to have to, the writ of mandamus, I believe, occurred with respect to the initial request. I don't recall one on the second request, but it may have happened.
You would agree there was a writ of mandamus filed?
At some point, it was my understanding that a writ had been filed.
Okay, and you're not going to tell this jury when that suit was resolved, are you?
No.
For a matter of fact, it could have been pending into the winter of the next year, true?
As far as I know, and for clarity, when you say writ of mandamus, I'm assuming you're talking about federal practice.
No, I'm talking about writ of mandamus in the district court for the Department of Public Safety records.
You're talking about the second issue then? Okay.
Yeah.
No, yeah, there was a pending action in the district court.
Okay, so they weren't just going to Office of Attorney General to try and get these records that they were after, right?
Could you repeat one more time?
They weren't just going to the Office of Attorney General, Nate Paul and his lawyers. They were also going to the district court to try and get the records they were after, correct?
That was my understanding.
Okay. Now, DPS was not required to disclose records after this refusal to rule, right?
Our refusal to rule did not require them to disclose.
Okay. You stated that that was contrary to precedent at the Attorney General's office, true?
I did.
But you would have to admit that this specific request made by Nate Paul and his attorney Joe Larson had some unique circumstances, true?
I don't recall any unique circumstances.
Well, you worked with Justin Gordon pretty closely on this case, didn't you?
I worked with him very closely on the first file for SSB and somewhat, but less closely on the second file.
Okay. Could you so you really delegated it to Justin Gordon to handle, right?
No.
He was the man in charge of this decision, was he not?
He was the head of Open Records, answering to Ryan Vassar, the deputy for legal counsel at the time.
And he drafted opinions, and he drafted the opinion to refuse to rule that you edited, true?
I did edit the opinion.
Okay.